You're watching the legal breakdown. So, Glenn, we've got a really consequential update from the Supreme Court with regard to Trump's immunity case. Can you speak about this announcement?
So we just learned that the Supreme Court will grant review of Donald Trump's baseless claim that he has absolute immunity against prosecution for crimes he committed while in office. So the way I would summarize what this means is it means the Supreme Court has just sold American democracy down the river. Here's why I say that's my take on what is now happening. The Supreme Court, first of all, should have rejected this case for review because, Brian, there is not one iota of support for the assertion that a president can commit all the crimes he wants in violation of our nation's laws against the American people and enjoy absolute immunity against being prosecuted, being held accountable for those crimes. Not one shred of legal support for that. In fact, the Constitution provides just the opposite in the impeachment judgment clause. So what the Supreme Court should have done is said, we do not accept this case for review. We return the case to Judge Tanya Chutkan, who's presiding over Donald Trump's federal prosecution in D.C. for trying to overturn the 2020 presidential election, and she can proceed to trial. That would have given Judge Chutkan the opportunity to proceed to trial and have that trial resolved well in advance of the November 2024 presidential election. But the Supreme Court just said, we're going to take the case for review. We're going to keep it on hold. We're not giving it back to Judge Chutkan, so the trial can't move forward even 1 millimeter. And we're not even going to bother hearing argument in this case until the week of April 22nd. What does that mean? It means by the time they hear arguments in the case, by the time they issue an opinion, which probably will not be on April 23rd, it will probably be weeks or perhaps months after they hear argument on April 22nd. It looks like we may have run out of time to get Donald Trump convicted federally before the November 2024 election. The Supreme Court just did an enormous favor for Donald Trump. And as I say, it feels like they've sold American democracy down the river.
Glenn, can we talk timeline here? Like if this case isn't being heard until April 22nd, then what is the fastest that a trial could actually take place?
All right, let's try to find a little bit of silver lining behind the big dark orange cloud that is Donald Trump. When the Supreme Court put the case on pause, right, so that Judge Chutkan's case could not move forward toward trial, they were 88 days out from the March 4 trial date that Judge Chutkan had sent. So let's say 90 days, 3 months. Judge Chutkan pledged that when I get the case returned to me, I will give the defense 90 days, just like they had when the case was put on pause. 90 days until we will begin the trial. So let's assume that the Supreme Court decides the case. I mean, this is wildly optimistic by the 1st of May. What that means is Judge Chutkan can't even start her trial until May, June, July, August 1st, and that's wildly optimistic. So she could, in theory, try her case during August into September, maybe get a jury verdict in September or October, but then it takes up to 90 days before there's even going to be a sentencing hearing. And assuming Donald Trump is found guilty on the charges by a jury, how could he not? The evidence against him is overwhelming. He wouldn't even be sentenced until well after the 2024 November election. And a conviction is not considered final until somebody is sentenced on the guilty charges, on the guilty findings by a jury. So I think chances are slim to none that we're going to get a finalized federal conviction against Donald Trump before the November 2024 election. And frankly, slim is fading fast.
Now, in terms of what trials could actually occur before the election, what are we looking at here?
So we have the New York trial, right? That's the case where Donald Trump tried to interfere in the 2016 presidential election by making hush money payments to playmates and porn stars to try to bury deeply damaging information from the American voters, basically to rob the American voters of the full value of their vote. And then he committed 34 felonies, falsifying business records to cover up those hush money payments, to lie about the nature of them. That trial is scheduled to kick off March 25th. It looks like it's in the chute for trial. So he could certainly be a convicted felon in the state of New York by May, April, June. That's a possibility. The other thing we can't completely discount is there's still a federal trial scheduled down in Florida for May 20th. We will know on probably March 1st, this Friday, whether that trial date will hold or not. And given that the Supreme Court has now said, well, we're going to take up absolute immunity, that doesn't really give Judge Cannon down in Florida a solid basis to continue the trial. Why do I say that? Because these crimes committed by Donald Trump, for which he's indicted down in Florida, were committed after he left the presidency. So he can't possibly have presidential immunity for things he did after he left the presidency. But I have had this gnawing feeling all along that Judge Cannon was going to find a way to delay, to cancel the May 20th trial date. That case will be up for a scheduling conference, a status hearing this Friday, March 1st. So we'll see if she tries to keep that trial date on the calendar or if she kicks it down the road. So there is an outside chance that if the federal trial in Florida starts late May, that one could be wrapped up before the 2024 presidential election. But I am not placing my buck on that trial date sticking down in Florida.
And let's finish off with this. Glenn, back in 2000, the Supreme Court heard Bush v. Gore and decided that case all in the course of like 3 days. So why is this absurd question of complete and total immunity for Donald Trump, why does this need 3 months to even begin arguments when clearly the Supreme Court is capable of taking a case faster than that?
It doesn't take 3 months. I mean, this issue has been briefed up and down by both parties. The Supreme Court could have set this for oral argument next week and resolved it promptly. You know, they could not throw that 2000 election to Bush quickly enough within days, and yet they can't even take up the issue of whether Donald Trump, should be in a position to be held accountable for the crimes he committed against the American people while he was president. This is absurd. It's obscene. And it feels like the Supreme Court, at least a certain block of the Supreme Court justices, are squarely in Donald Trump's corner.
And I would just note for people watching, because I know like this is very clearly bad news, but and I've said this before in my videos and I'll say it again here, it was never wholly on the Supreme Court to protect us from Donald Trump. We can't rely on the courts, nor have we ever been able to rely solely on the courts. We can't rely on lawyers. We can't rely on state parties. We can't rely on lawmakers. It's always been up to us to figure out how to, show up on election day, get our friends and families, neighbors, coworkers, all of our loved ones, those people in our circles to show up on election day, to get our ballots, to fill them out, and to make sure that we vote for Joe Biden ahead of the November election to make sure that Donald Trump doesn't get anywhere near the levers of power. This isn't a done deal. This doesn't mean that Donald Trump is going to become the next president. It just means that he won't be convicted in time to show people the convicted felon that he will be. But at the same time, the responsibility has always been on us, on the voters, to make sure that we show up. Like, we're the only ones who can save ourselves, who can save this democracy. And so that remains true. That was true then. It stays true now. So just like one...
Brian, let me say, that is such an excellent point. The minute I saw this news break, two things struck me. One, I was a little sick to my stomach because I really do feel like this is the Supreme Court throwing a win Donald Trump's way, at least on the procedural front, not necessarily on the substantive front. But this will do potentially real damage to American democracy because it will open Donald Trump up to be, I don't want to call him a viable candidate, but a candidate in the 2024 presidential election. Not that a federal conviction for trying to overturn the prior election's results would have legally disqualified him, but I do believe it would have practically disqualified him. But here's why your point is such an excellent one. The minute after I felt like this is the Supreme Court selling American democracy down the river, the next instant I felt like, okay, it's up to us again. It's up to we the people again to get out in numbers, too big to rig, too real to steal, and to just shut the damn door on this insurrectionist Donald Trump once and for all at the polls, even though we know he will say this election is rigged too. He may try to launch another attack, but I say bring it on, because we're not going to give up our democracy that easy.
Perfectly put. Seems like the perfect place to leave off. So, of course, for everybody watching, we will continue to stay on top of all of this, especially to Glenn's earlier point, this status hearing that's coming up in the Florida case this Friday. So, of course, for everybody watching right now, if you want to stay along with this stuff, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Teller Cohen.
And I'm a very pissed off Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.